My name is Carmen, and at 32, I thought burying my parents after a car crash would be the hardest day of my entire life. I was wrong. The real nightmare began hours later when their attorney revealed I was the sole heir to their $24 million estate. My brother Andre demanded I sign over every penny to him immediately. When I refused, he had his security drag me out into the pouring rain. He thought he could leave me homeless, so I drove straight to our parents' suburban mansion and moved myself in. The next morning, Andre and his wife showed up with an eviction team. But their smug smiles vanished the second they realized exactly who was waiting inside. Before I share the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I dismantled my brother's perfect life piece by piece. The mahogany walls of Attorney Caldwell's office felt suffocating. It had barely been a week since the crash took our parents. The grief was a raw wound, but there was no time to mourn. We were here for the reading of the will. Andre sat across from me. At 36, he was the golden child, the vice president of the family media company, wearing his bespoke suit like armor. Next to him sat his wife Lauren, playing the grieving daughter-in-law. She dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, her blonde hair flawlessly styled. Caldwell cleared his throat. The estate, including all liquid assets, property, and business holdings, totals approximately $24 million. Caldwell paused, looking directly at me. The entire estate is left solely to Carmen. The silence in the room was absolute. It lasted exactly 3 seconds before Andre slammed his fist onto the conference table, rattling the coffee cups. "That is a mistake!" Andre roared, standing up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. "Read it again, Caldwell. My parents would never leave the family legacy to her. She is a useless auditor who does nothing to build wealth in this family. I am a senior federal financial investigator handling corporate fraud for the government." I corrected him, my voice dangerously calm. "But you never cared to learn my actual job title, did you, Andre? You think you are so smart with your federal badge. You contribute absolutely nothing to the family business. You have always been a disappointment, and now you think you can steal my inheritance." Lauren placed a manicured hand on his arm, pulling him back. She turned to me with that familiar patronizing smile she used to mask her cruelty. "Carmen, honey, let us be reasonable." Lauren said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You know Andre is the rightful head of this family now. Your parents must not have been in their right minds. You need to sign a renunciation form right now and transfer everything to Andre." I watched Lauren closely. She had always used her white tears to manipulate situations. "And if I do not sign?" I asked, leaning back. "You really want to play this game, Carmen? The luxury apartment you live in is completely under Andre's name. His pristine credit secured that lease because you could not afford it on a government salary. If you do not sign these papers today, we will terminate the lease by midnight. You will be on the street with your bags in the rain. We do not want to make you homeless, sweetheart, but you are forcing our hand." For 5 years, they had held that apartment over my head, treating me like a charity case. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a bound folder, and tossed it across the table. "What is this?" Andre snapped. "That is a 5-year record of bank transfers," I stated, keeping my eyes locked on Lauren. "Every single month, I transferred the full rent amount plus a 20% maintenance fee directly into your personal account, Andre. I paid for that apartment with my own hard-earned money. You just insisted on keeping the lease in your name to maintain financial control over me." Lauren's face flushed a deep crimson as she stared at the bank statements. Andre snatched the folder, his jaw working furiously, as he realized his ultimate leverage over me was completely fabricated. "You are out of your mind if you think you are walking out of here with my money," Andre hissed, stepping toward me. "Sign the papers, Carmen. Sign them right now, or I swear you will regret it." I stood up, matching his height. "I am not signing anything. The estate is mine." Andre's face contorted with pure rage. He turned to the 2 private security guards he had brought with him. "Throw her out," he ordered. "Make sure she has nothing but the clothes on her back." The guard stepped forward, grabbing me roughly by the arms. Caldwell protested, but Andre shouted him down. I did not scream or beg. The cold water soaked through my suit instantly, but I did not shiver. I felt a fire burning deep in my chest. Andre thought he had won. He thought he could strip me of my dignity and leave me shivering in the storm. He forgot exactly who he was dealing with. I walked to my car, wiped the rain from my face, and started the engine. I did not drive to the apartment he was threatening to take from me. I drove straight to our parents' sprawling suburban mansion. I pulled into the driveway, unlocked the heavy front oak doors, and physically claimed my space. I sat in the dark living room, listening to the rain beat against the large windows, waiting for the morning. I knew exactly what Andre and Lauren would do next, and I was absolutely ready to give them the biggest shock of their entitled lives. The morning sun streamed through the massive bay windows of the suburban mansion. The scent of old wood and my mother's lingering floral perfume hung heavy in the air. I stood in the kitchen brewing a pot of black coffee. I had not slept much, but my mind was sharper than it had been in days. I knew Andre would not wait long. He was a man obsessed with control, and I had just stripped him of it. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. Right on cue, the sound of heavy tires crunching over the gravel driveway echoed through the quiet house. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid steady my nerves. Looking through the sheer curtains, I watched my brother's shiny black luxury SUV jerk to a halt, followed closely by a dark, unmarked van. 4 burly men in tactical gear stepped out, stretching their necks and looking menacing. Andre emerged, his face a mask of furious entitlement, while Lauren slid out of the passenger side, already holding her phone up to her face. They did not bother ringing the doorbell. Andre still had his spare key, and the heavy oak front door banged open with enough force to shake the picture frames in the foyer. He marched in his polished designer shoes, tracking mud across the pristine Persian rug our mother had loved so much. The private security detail flooded the entryway behind him, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. I stepped out of the kitchen, leaning casually against the archway, my coffee mug warm in my hands. Andre stopped in his tracks when he saw me, his jaw clenching. He pointed a shaking finger at me and barked an order to his men. "Grab her and get her out of here. Do not let her pack anything. Just throw her on the street." The men hesitated for a fraction of a second, likely confused by my complete lack of panic. I simply stood there, watching the pathetic display of fragile masculinity unfold. Behind Andre, Lauren was busy putting on a show. She held her phone at the perfect angle, the soft glow of a portable ring light illuminating her perfectly practiced expression of distress. I could hear her hushed, tearful voice echoing in the hallway. "Guys, it is just so hard right now," Lauren whispered into her phone, dabbing at her dry eyes. "We are grieving the loss of Andre's parents, and now we are dealing with a break-in. My sister-in-law has completely lost her mind. She broke into the family home last night and is refusing to leave. It is terrifying, honestly. We had to hire private security just to feel safe." She panned the camera to catch a glimpse of the large men in tactical gear, carefully keeping Andre's furious face out of the frame. She was spinning a narrative in real time, weaponizing her fragile white woman tears to paint me as the dangerous, unhinged black woman terrorizing their grieving family. It was a strategy she had used for years to isolate me, and she executed it flawlessly. I took another sip of coffee, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately wanted to capture on camera. My silence only infuriated Andre more. He closed the distance between us, invading my personal space, his face turning a blotchy red. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale alcohol, a telltale sign that he had spent the night drinking his anger away. "You think you are so smart," he sneered, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what belongs to me? You are nothing, Carmen. You have always been nothing but a drain on this family." I kept my gaze steady, staring directly into his bloodshot eyes. He hated when I did not flinch. "You owe Mom and Dad your pathetic life," Andre shouted, stepping even closer. "Do you think I forgot about college? Do you think I forgot how much money they wasted sending you to those fancy clinics when you had your little mental breakdown?" They spent thousands of dollars to keep you from completely losing your mind. They paid for your therapy, your hospital stays, your ridiculous medications. You were a broken, expensive liability. They bled themselves dry trying to fix your depression, and this is how you repay them. By trying to steal the legacy I built. You owe us everything. His words were designed to cut deep to trigger the shame I used to carry about my mental health struggles. For a long time, my family had treated my depression as a personal failing, a moral weakness that inconvenienced their perfect image. They had constantly reminded me of the financial cost of my treatment, using it as a leash to demand my gratitude and compliance. But I was not that scared, 22-year-old girl anymore. I had spent years in therapy untangling their toxic web. I knew my worth, and I knew exactly how much of the family legacy Andre had actually built. He had not built anything, he had only drained it. I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with disgust. "You are embarrassing yourself, Andre," I said softly. My calm tone seemed to act as a physical blow. He turned wildly to his security team. "I told you to get her out of here," he roared, his voice cracking. "Drag her out by her hair if you have to. Do it now!" Two of the largest guards stepped forward, their faces grim as they reached out to grab my arms. Lauren angled her phone to capture my impending humiliation, a satisfied smirk finally breaking through her tearful facade. But before the guards could lay a single finger on me, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the back hallway. The sound came directly from our late father's private study. Everyone in the foyer froze. The security guards stopped in their tracks, looking confused. Andre turned around, his face twisting from rage to bewilderment. "Who else is in this house?" Andre demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "Did you bring your pathetic friends here, Carmen?" I did not say a word. I just watched the heavy mahogany double doors of the study slowly swing open. The brass hinges creaked in the sudden silence of the house. 4 men and 2 women stepped out into the hallway. They were not wearing tactical gear or private security uniforms. They wore crisp, business casual attire, and draped around their necks or clipped to their belts were bright, unmistakable federal badges. They were wearing dark windbreakers with large yellow letters printed across the back. 2 of them read IRS, and the others read FBI. In their hands, they carried heavy cardboard banker boxes sealed tight with bright red evidence tape. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense posture, stopped at the end of the hallway, holding a stack of financial ledgers. Andre's mouth fell open, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling. The color drained completely from Lauren's face, and her phone slipped from her hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The live stream went black, but the real show was just beginning. The lead agent stepped forward, her silver badge gleaming brightly against her dark navy jacket. She introduced herself calmly as Special Agent Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crime Division. Andre took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the chest of one of his own private security guards. He demanded to know what was going on, claiming this was private property and they had absolutely no warrant to be there. Agent Miller simply smiled, a cold, clinical smile that sent a shiver down my spine. She informed him that a warrant was entirely unnecessary when the sole legal owner of the estate had already granted them full, unrestricted access. She looked directly at me and gave a curt nod of professional respect. I nodded back, holding my ground. I had spent the entire night not just sitting in the dark living room, but actively compiling a mountain of evidence. I had logged into the secure federal database linking my parents' financial records to the corporate accounts Andre had been managing for the past 5 years. What I found was a staggering web of shell companies' offshore wire transfers and blatant embezzlement. I had authorized the federal raid before the sun even came up today. Lauren scrambled to pick up her shattered phone, her hands shaking violently. She tried to use her usual tactic of playing the fragile victim, demanding the agents leave her alone because she was a grieving daughter-in-law who had just lost family. Agent Miller ignored her completely, handing Andre a formal printed notice of investigation into his personal and corporate accounts. The moment Andre read the specific account numbers listed on that document, the arrogant golden child facade completely shattered. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had closed. Without a single word to his security team or to me, he grabbed Lauren by the arm and shoved past the federal agents fleeing out the front door. We watched them sprint to their luxury SUV, leaving their hired muscle standing awkwardly in the hallway. I dismissed the private security guards, informing them their clients' accounts were currently being frozen and they would likely not be paid for their theatrical performance today. They cleared out within minutes, leaving me alone with the agents to continue the crucial work of securing my parents' home. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was back at my federal office building downtown. The adrenaline from the morning ambush was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I knew Andre would not take this lying down, and I knew exactly who he would run to for backup when his money was threatened. My phone had been ringing incessantly for hours, displaying the names of relatives who had not bothered to check on me once since the fatal car crash. I ignored all of them, focusing my energy on tracing the rest of the vanished family funds. The heavy glass doors of our departmental lobby suddenly banged open. My administrative assistant tried to stop her, but Aunt Vivian bulldozed her way past the reception desk. She was followed by 3 of my older cousins, all of them marching into my workspace with self-righteous fury painted clearly on their faces. Aunt Vivian was my father's older sister, the self-appointed matriarch of our extended family. She had always commanded a room with her loud voice and her absolute demand for blind family loyalty. She slammed her heavy designer purse onto my desk, knocking over my coffee cup. The dark liquid spilled across my notes, but I did not blink or move to clean it up. I slowly stood up, meeting her furious glare. She started screaming immediately, not caring that dozens of my federal colleagues were watching the spectacle through the glass walls. She called me a traitor to my own blood. She yelled that a black family must always protect its own in a world that is already stacked against us, and that calling federal agents on my own flesh and blood was the ultimate betrayal. "You are tearing this family apart, Carmen," she screamed, her voice echoing down the quiet corridor. "Andre is a good man, carrying your father's legacy, and you are trying to put him in a cage out of pure spite and jealousy." She went on to say that my parents were barely cold in the ground, and I was acting like a vicious animal, destroying my own brother. My cousins chimed in, nodding aggressively behind her. They reminded me of how much Andre had supposedly sacrificed to run the business while I selfishly went off to work for the government. They weaponized the concept of community, telling me I was a total disgrace to our people for weaponizing the justice system against my own family. I let them yell. I let Aunt Vivian perform her dramatic monologue about family honor and sacrifice. I let her play the role of the devoted matriarch, protecting the family flock from the evil sister. When she finally paused to take a breath, her chest heaving with righteous indignation, I reached across my desk and tapped my computer keyboard. The large smartboard on the wall behind me blinked to life. I did not raise my voice or scream back at them. I simply directed their attention to the glowing screen. What popped up was a scanned copy of a highly confidential asset transfer agreement. I watched Aunt Vivian as her eyes locked onto the document. The righteous fury melted from her face, instantly replaced by sheer raw terror. My cousins squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the complicated legal jargon. "Let us talk about protecting the family legacy." "Aunt Vivian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent office. "Let us talk about true family loyalty. This is a contract from exactly 3 years ago. It shows the quiet private sale of our family most profitable commercial real estate holdings, the very properties my father worked his entire life to secure for our future." I pointed to the signatures at the bottom of the illuminated screen. "You convinced my father to give you limited power of attorney while he was recovering from his heart surgery, claiming you wanted to help ease his burden and protect the business. But you did not help him at all. You secretly sold those prime assets to a private shell corporation." My cousins looked from the screen to their mother, their faces twisting in deep confusion. One of my cousins asked who bought the properties. his voice trembling slightly as he realized the implication. I pressed another button on my keyboard, and the ownership structure of the Shell Corporation filled the screen in stark black and white. Lauren, I answered, watching Aunt Vivian physically shrink back against the wall. Lauren bought them using money Andre embezzled directly from the operational accounts. Aunt Vivian facilitated the sale of our core family assets to my manipulative sister-in-law, and in exchange, Vivian received a massive $2 million consulting fee, deposited directly into a hidden offshore account. You sold out the entire family legacy for a payout, Aunt Vivian, and you handed the keys to the very woman who looks down on all of us. The entire room fell into a deathly silence as the undeniable proof of her ultimate betrayal glowed brightly on the wall, leaving my family completely stunned and speechless. The silence in my office was broken only by the sound of Aunt Vivian gasping for air. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as my cousins stared at her in horror. I did not wait for their hollow apologies. I pointed to the glass doors and told them to leave my workspace before I had them escorted out by armed security. They scrambled out, leaving the undeniable truth of their greed projected brightly on my wall. I knew the blow would send shockwaves through the family, but I underestimated the sheer manipulative desperation of my sister-in-law. By Friday morning, my phone was ringing non-stop. It was not from repentant relatives. It was from high-profile clients and federal contacts. The director of a corporate compliance board called me at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with panic. He told me I needed to look at social media immediately because my name was trending nationwide and it was not for my investigative work. I opened my laptop with a knot forming in my stomach and saw the thumbnail of a popular true crime podcast. Sitting in the guest chair, tragically heartbroken, was Lauren. She wore a simple pastel dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a loose braid to make her look fragile and deeply vulnerable. The host leaned in sympathetically as Lauren wiped away perfectly timed tears with a monogrammed tissue. Lauren was weaving a masterful fake narrative about her life, marrying into an affluent African-American family. She looked directly into the camera lens and sobbed about how hard she had tried to fit in, how she had embraced their culture only to be met with relentless cruelty and racial hostility from her husband's jealous sister. Lauren claimed I resented her for marrying the golden boy of the family. She painted me as an angry, bitter monster actively trying to destroy my own brother's life. She told the host that my parents had loved her like a daughter, and I had driven them away with my toxic behavior. The absolute worst part was when she fabricated a twisted story about the night our parents died. She choked out a sob, claiming I had cornered her at the funeral and threatened to ruin her life because I hated seeing a white woman inherit my family legacy. She weaponized every single stereotype she could find, playing the fragile victim to absolute perfection. The comment section beneath the video was a toxic cesspool of outrage and hatred. Strangers were calling for my immediate termination from my federal position. They branded me a racist, a narcissist, and a greedy manipulator trying to steal from a grieving family. The social media backlash hit my hard-earned reputation like a runaway freight train. My inbox was flooded with hate mail and death threats. Clients who had trusted my firm for years were suddenly sending frantic emails demanding to suspend our contracts. My phone buzzed with an urgent text from my agency supervisor asking me to come in for a mandatory administrative review pending an internal investigation. Lauren had successfully turned the entire world against me without a single shred of actual evidence. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that in the court of public opinion, a crying white woman holding a tissue would always win against a strong, independent black woman refusing to break. She expected me to hide from the shame. She expected me to cower in my dark apartment, lose my job, and beg for mercy. She clearly did not know me at all. I calmly replied to my supervisor, explaining that the situation was a targeted defamation attempt being handled legally, and I would provide a full report on Monday. Then I closed my laptop and walked deliberately into my closet. Lauren and Andre thought they had won. I had seen on their joint social media account that they were hosting a lavish victory party that very evening at the most exclusive private club in Atlanta. It was supposedly a charity gala honoring my late parents, but everyone knew it was just a glamorous stage. They wanted to soak up the public sympathy and secure their place in elite high society. I reached past my usual business suits and pulled out a custom-tailored crimson red gown that hugged every single curve of my body. It was high-end couture I had bought in Paris to celebrate my biggest federal case win. It was bold, unapologetic, and demanded absolute attention. I paired it with the vintage diamond drop necklace my grandmother had given me, the exact same necklace Lauren had openly coveted. I styled my hair perfectly and applied a bold red lip that screamed total confidence. I looked in the mirror and I did not see a defeated, broken woman. I saw a woman who owned the world and was about to take out the trash. I drove through the evening traffic toward the sprawling country club. It was a historic, heavily guarded building with sweeping white columns and strict rules about entry. Old money gathered here to protect their secrets. Andre had spent 5 grueling years kissing up to the wealthy board members just to get his name on the waiting list. He was desperate for their validation, eager to be accepted by the very people who secretly looked down on his new money flashiness. I pulled up to the valet, tossed the keys to the attendant, and walked up the marble steps with steady, measured strides. The heavy mahogany front doors were guarded by 2 large men in dark suits who held thick clipboards. One of them stepped forward, holding up a hand to block my path, telling me that this was a private event. I simply reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my Elite Lifetime Legacy membership card. The guard swallowed hard, stepped back quickly, and pulled open the heavy door, completely ready for me to ruin their perfect party. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Heritage Country Club. The space was dripping with excessive wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the crowd. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos carried silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and caviar. The room was packed with the elite African-American high society of Atlanta. These were the judges, doctors, federal executives, and corporate titans that Andre had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to impress. In the center of the room, holding court by an elaborate ice sculpture, stood Lauren and Andre. Lauren was wearing a pale pink designer gown, playing the role of the tragic but resilient daughter-in-law. She was dabbing her eyes while a group of wealthy older women offered her sympathetic pats on the arm. Andre was nearby, laughing too loudly with a group of club board members, holding a glass of scotch and acting like the triumphant heir to a throne he did not build. The moment I walked in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. My crimson red couture gown was a sharp, stark contrast to the muted, respectful tones everyone else was wearing. It was a dress designed to demand absolute attention, and it did its job perfectly. The soft jazz music playing in the background seemed to fade as heads began to turn in my direction. Whispers rippled through the elegant crowd. People recognized me from the toxic podcast interview Lauren had released that very morning. They expected to see a broken, humiliated woman hiding from the world. Instead, they saw me walking with my head held high, the vintage diamond drop necklace sparkling against my skin. Andre spotted me, and the smug smile vanished from his face instantly. His eyes widened in sheer panic before contorting into a mask of pure rage. He slammed his scotch glass down on a passing waiter's tray and marched toward the center of the room. He immediately began waving his hands and snapping his fingers, signaling the club security guards who were stationed near the exits. He pointed directly at me, his face turning a blotchy red. He shouted across the quiet room, demanding that the guards remove me immediately. He yelled that I was a trespasser and an unhinged woman who was stalking his family. The 2 large security guards started moving quickly in my direction. I did not run, and I did not argue. I kept my eyes locked on the main stage at the front of the ballroom, where a single silver microphone stood on a sleek acrylic podium. I walked with absolute purpose, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The crowd parted for me instinctively, stepping back as if I were a force of nature. Andre pushed his way through the guests, screaming at the guards to hurry up and grab me. He yelled that I was having a psychotic break and needed to be restrained. The guards reached the edge of the stage just as I stepped up behind the podium. I wrapped my hand around the cold metal of the microphone. I did not say a single word to defend myself against my brother's accusations. I did not try to explain the truth to the crowd. I simply opened my designer clutch, pulled out my phone, and held it directly against the microphone. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The audio file had been buried deep in Aunt Vivian's personal cloud storage, which my federal team had legally seized during the morning raid. It was a recorded phone call between Aunt Vivian and Lauren from just a week ago. The sound of Lauren's voice echoed through the massive ballroom, amplified by the club's state-of-the-art sound system. Her voice was not the soft weeping tone she had used on the podcast. It was sharp, vicious, and dripping with entitled venom. The recording played loud and clear. Lauren was complaining bitterly about having to organize this charity gala. She whined about the cost of appeasing what she called the Black Socialite Mafia. The entire ballroom went dead silent as Lauren's voice filled the air. She used vile, disgusting racial slurs to describe the very board members who were currently standing in the room. She mocked the entire African-American elite of the city, calling them ghetto new money, trying to play dress-up in a country club. She laughed cruelly, telling Aunt Vivian that she could not stand being in the same room as these people. She explicitly stated that she only married into this pathetic family to secure her own financial future, and that she hated pretending to respect a bunch of people she considered entirely beneath her. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the grand ballroom. The security guards who had been reaching for me slowly lowered their hands, their faces tight with absolute disgust. They stepped away from the stage, leaving me standing there untouched. I looked down at the crowd, the elite black attendees, the very people Andre had spent 5 grueling years sucking up to, were staring at Lauren and Andre with a cold, devastating fury. The older women who had been comforting Lauren moments ago physically backed away from her, as if she were carrying a contagious disease. Lauren was trembling violently, her pale pink gown suddenly looking ridiculous. She shook her head, covering her mouth with her hands, trying to stammer out that the audio was fake or generated by artificial intelligence. Nobody believed her. The pure malice in her recorded voice was undeniably authentic. Mr. Sterling, the wealthy real estate mogul and head of the club membership committee, stepped out from the crowd. He was a proud, powerful man, and his face was a mask of cold, lethal authority. He walked slowly toward Andre, who was sweating profusely and looking frantically for an exit. Mr. Sterling did not raise his voice, but his words carried a heavy finality. He looked Andre straight in the eyes and informed him that his presence was a toxic stain on the legacy of the club. Mr. Sterling announced clearly that Andre's membership was permanently revoked, effective immediately. He told Andre and his wife that they were a disgrace and ordered them to get off the property before he had them thrown out like common criminals. Andre stood there watching his entire social and professional future crumble into dust. The wealthy connections he needed to sustain his stolen lifestyle were rejecting him publicly and permanently. His social climbing wife was now a complete pariah in the city. The panic in his eyes turned into a dark, dangerous desperation. He realized he had lost everything in front of the most powerful people in the state. He slowly backed away from Mr. Sterling, pulling his phone from his tuxedo jacket. I watched him from the stage, my face completely neutral. I saw the exact moment his mind shifted to a terrifying new strategy. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear, his eyes locked onto mine with a sickening intensity. He changed his posture completely, hunching his shoulders and forcing his voice to tremble. He was calling 911. I could hear him speaking to the emergency operator, his voice a perfect imitation of a terrified victim. He falsely reported that his sister had violently broken into a private event. He begged the operator to send the police and an ambulance immediately, claiming I was severely mentally unstable, having a violent psychotic break, and desperately needed an involuntary psychiatric hold. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand windows of the country club within minutes. Andre put on the performance of a lifetime as the police officers marched into the ballroom. He rushed up to them with tears streaming down his face, playing the role of the terrified but loving older brother. He pulled his phone out and shoved it into the face of the lead officer. He showed them digital copies of my medical records from 10 years ago when I was a grieving college student battling severe clinical depression. He pointed at me and told the officers I was off my medication and having a violent psychotic episode. He claimed I had broken into his private event screaming delusions about federal agents and stolen money. The officers approached me with their hands resting cautiously on their belts. They told me to turn around and place my hands behind my back for my own safety. I did not fight them. I did not raise my voice or try to explain the truth to the local police. I knew exactly how this game was played. If I yelled or resisted, Andre would use it as absolute proof that I was unhinged. So I simply turned around and let the cold metal handcuffs click around my wrists. I walked out of that club with my head held high, ignoring the whispers of the wealthy elite who were watching my apparent downfall. The ride to the hospital was silent. I sat in the back of the ambulance while a paramedic checked my vitals, finding them perfectly normal. They bypassed the regular emergency room and took me straight to the secure psychiatric evaluation wing. The heavy steel doors locked behind me with a loud, echoing thud. They placed me in a stark white holding cell with a single metal table bolted to the floor and a cold metal chair. The fluorescent lights hummed loudly above me. I sat there alone for nearly 2 hours. The room smelled of strong bleach and old fear. I was not afraid, though. I knew my federal team was already tracking my location and listening to my secure smartwatch, which was still tucked safely inside my designer clutch they had confiscated and placed in the lockbox right outside my door. Finally, the heavy door clicked open. Andre walked in wearing a smug, triumphant smile that made my stomach turn. He was not alone. A tall, thin man in a pristine white lab coat followed him inside, carrying a leather medical clipboard. Andre locked the door behind them and leaned casually against the white wall. The fake tears and brotherly concern from the country club were completely gone. He looked at me like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He introduced the man as Dr. Vance, the head of psychiatric evaluations for the facility. Dr. Vance did not even bother to look at my medical chart. He simply placed a thick stack of legal documents on the metal table and slid a silver pen across the surface toward me. "This is how it ends," Carmen Andre said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are going to sign these transfer papers right now and give me full control of the $24 million estate. If you sign them, Dr. Vance will declare you emotionally exhausted but legally sane, and you can walk right out of those doors. If you do not sign them, Dr. Vance is going to sign a medical affidavit declaring you a severe danger to yourself and others. You will be heavily sedated and locked in a permanent psychiatric facility indefinitely." Andre stepped forward, slamming his hands down on the metal table. He laughed, a dark, cruel sound that echoed in the small room. "You really thought you could outsmart me?" he taunted. "You forgot how the real world works. A judge is always going to believe a successful family man and media executive over a hysterical black woman with a documented history of mental instability. You are a college dropout who spent months in a clinic crying over mom and dad. Society loves to label us as crazy Carmen. I'm just using the system to my advantage. You have absolutely no power here." Dr. Vance tapped the paperwork with his manicured finger. He told me in a cold, clinical voice that my refusal to cooperate was a clear symptom of paranoid delusions. He said he had a syringe of heavy sedatives waiting in the hallway, and he would not hesitate to authorize an involuntary injection if I became combative. They were attempting to extort me for $24 million while using the threat of medical imprisonment as their weapon. It was a terrifying, brilliant plan, but it relied on one massive miscalculation. They thought I was alone and vulnerable. They forgot that I was a senior federal investigator who spent my life taking down corrupt organizations. I looked down at the fraudulent transfer documents. Then I looked up at the corner of the ceiling. A small black security camera blinked with a steady red light. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I smiled a bright, genuine smile that made the blood drain from Andre's face. I leaned back in my cold metal chair and stared directly at my brother. "You spent a lot of money to bribe this doctor, Andre," I said softly. "But you forgot to do your research on this specific facility. This hospital receives federal funding, which means extortion and medical fraud committed within these walls fall under strict federal jurisdiction. And you just confessed to all of it on a live audio feed." Andre opened his mouth to speak, but the heavy metal door suddenly burst open, hitting the wall with a deafening crash. The room was instantly flooded with armed FBI agents in dark tactical gear. They pushed past a stunned Andre and immediately surrounded Dr. Vance. But it was the man who walked in behind them that made my brother completely collapse against the table. It was Judge Carter Morrison, a highly respected federal judge who had been working directly with my investigative task force for the past 6 months. He was holding a stack of freshly signed warrants in his hand. Judge Morrison looked at the corrupt doctor with absolute disgust. He held up the federal warrant for Dr. Vance's immediate arrest, citing a massive ongoing investigation into a ring of medical professionals signing fraudulent psychiatric holds for wealthy clients. The agent slammed Dr. Vance against the wall and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, ignoring his frantic protests. Judge Morrison then turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward my brother, who was now trembling uncontrollably. Andre realized in that devastating moment that he had not trapped me in a psych ward at all. I had lured him into a federal cage, and he had walked right in and handed us the key. The swift click of the federal handcuffs echoing in that sterile psychiatric ward should have been the end of Andre's pathetic rebellion. But a man who has spent his entire life stealing from his own family does not surrender easily. Thanks to the expensive lawyers paid for with my parents' stolen money, Andre managed to secure a temporary release while his federal criminal charges were pending. His first act of desperation was to file for an emergency probate hearing. He was completely terrified that I was about to liquidate the $24 million estate and cut off the only lifeline he had left. The courtroom was cold and smelled of old paper and lemon polish. I sat alone at the defendant's table wearing a sharp navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight. I had waived my right to outside counsel, choosing to represent myself. Across the aisle, Andre sat next to a sleazy, high-priced attorney named Richard Sterling. Lauren sat in the gallery directly behind them, wearing oversized dark sunglasses and a plain black dress to play the part of a victimized wife. Judge Harrison, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, called the emergency hearing to order. Sterling immediately stood up and launched into a theatrical performance. He slapped a thick binder of financial documents onto the judge's desk, claiming they proved I was completely incompetent to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. Sterling argued that my parents' legacy required sophisticated corporate management and that I was nothing more than a low-level government employee with zero understanding of high finance. He pointed at me and told the judge that turning the estate over to me would result in immediate financial ruin for the entire family. Andre nodded solemnly beside him, acting like a deeply concerned older brother, trying to protect the family wealth from a clueless sibling. They actually submitted fabricated bank statements and altered credit reports, trying to paint me as financially irresponsible and prone to reckless spending. It was the exact same gaslighting tactic my family had used against me for my entire life. Growing up, Andre was always praised for his aggressive business instincts, while my meticulous, careful nature was dismissed as boring and small-minded. My parents threw massive parties when Andre was handed his fake vice president title, but they barely even acknowledged my graduation. I remembered sitting at the Thanksgiving table 5 years ago, listening to my father brag about Andre's real estate deals. When my aunt asked about my career, my mother laughed and said I was just a paper pusher settling for a mediocre government salary because I lacked the drive to survive in the real corporate world. They never bothered to ask what my job actually entailed. If they had, they would have known that a senior federal financial investigator does not just push paper. We dismantle international crime syndicates, track millions of dollars through offshore shell companies, and put arrogant white-collar criminals in federal prison. The judge flipped through the binder of forged documents, his brow furrowing. He looked down at me and asked if I had retained counsel to defend against these serious allegations of financial incompetence. I slowly stood up from my table, buttoning my suit jacket. I told the judge that I did not need a lawyer because the documents Mr. Sterling just submitted to a federal court were entirely fraudulent. Sterling's face turned purple as he demanded the judge silence me for making outrageous accusations. I ignored him and walked directly to the projector screen in the middle of the courtroom. I plugged in my encrypted federal laptop and pulled up the genuine, unredacted financial histories of both myself and my brother. The screen illuminated with undeniable hard data. I broke down the exact metadata of the document Sterling had just submitted, proving conclusively that the timestamps had been altered on Andre's personal computer less than 48 hours ago. The judge leaned forward, staring at the screen in absolute shock. I then pulled up the audit trail of the family corporate accounts, the same accounts Andre claimed he was so brilliantly managing. I methodically traced the exact paths where Andre had bled the company dry, funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into private gambling accounts and offshore trusts to hide his massive debts. I showed the judge the exact wire transfers, the fake vendor invoices, and the inflated expense reports Andre had used to fund Lauren's lavish lifestyle. I spoke with cold clinical precision, using the exact financial jargon that Andre and his lawyer claimed I could not possibly understand. I did not stop there. I showed the court my own impeccable financial history, including the high-level security clearances required for my position. I explained to the judge that the only reason my brother was standing in this courtroom trying to steal my inheritance was because his own personal assets were currently frozen by the Federal Bureau of Investigation based on a warrant that I had personally secured. The gallery was dead silent. Lauren had pulled her sunglasses down, staring at the screen with her mouth hanging open. Andre looked like he was about to physically vomit. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. He had brought fake papers to a financial battle against a federal auditor, and I was destroying his entire defense piece by piece. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, his face tight with anger. He looked directly at Sterling and warned him that submitting forged financial documents to his court was a fast track to disbarment and federal prison. He stated that my financial competency was not only proven, but vastly superior to anyone else in the room. The judge picked up his gavel, preparing to dismiss Andre's pathetic emergency injunction and officially grant me total unrestricted control of the estate. Victory tasted incredibly sweet in that moment. The legacy was mine, and I was finally free from their control. I could see the sheer panic radiating from Andre as his last hope evaporated in front of his eyes. But just as the heavy wooden gavel was about to strike the sounding block, Sterling suddenly slammed his hand down on the table. His face was sweating, but his eyes burned with a manic, desperate energy. He shouted for the judge to wait, claiming they had one final piece of evidence that superseded everything else. Sterling reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. He ripped it open and slapped a single document onto the table. He announced to the completely silent courtroom that what he held was a second will, a newly discovered document supposedly signed by my parents mere hours before their fatal car crash, naming Andre as the sole executor and total beneficiary of the entire estate. The heavy thud of the manila envelope hitting the mahogany table echoed through the silent courtroom. Richard Sterling stood with his chest puffed out, wearing a sickeningly triumphant grin as he slid the crisp document toward the judge. He announced that this was the true final testament of my late parents discovered just yesterday, hidden in the floorboards of their old estate. I stared at the piece of paper, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach, but I kept my face completely impassive. Judge Harrison snatched the document, his jaw tight with irritation. Sterling practically vibrated with smug energy as he narrated the terms of this supposed miracle will. He explained that my parents had drastically changed their minds hours before their fatal car crash. According to this new document, they had stripped me of all executor duties and placed the entire $24 million estate into a private family trust. And the sole manager of that trust was not even my brother. It was his wife, Lauren. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering. They were trying to completely cut me out of my own family bloodline by handing the keys to our empire over to a woman who despised everything my parents stood for. Lauren sat up straighter in the gallery behind them, pushing her dark sunglasses up into her blonde hair. She looked like a queen who had just been handed her crown. Andre leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, crossing his arms over his chest. The judge read through the document, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. The silence in the room stretched out until the tension was almost suffocating. Finally, Judge Harrison tossed the paper back onto his desk. He looked directly at me and then at Sterling. He stated that the sudden appearance of a superseding will under these highly suspicious circumstances was incredibly convenient. He noted the active federal investigation into my brother, but his hands were tied by strict probate law. A newly presented will had to be authenticated before any final judgments could be made. The law required due process, even when the fraud was glaringly obvious to anyone with basic common sense. The judge slammed his gavel down and announced that he was freezing every single asset in the estate immediately. No one would touch a dime of the $24 million until a full forensic investigation was completed. As the judge stood up to leave the bench, Andre turned to look at me. He did not look defeated by the freeze. Instead, a slow, dark smirk spread across his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had stalled my victory and secured his wife's control over my parents' legacy. He honestly believed that pouring fake documents into the legal system would drown me in paperwork and exhaust my resources until I simply gave up and walked away. I did not react to his childish gloating. I calmly walked over to Sterling's table and picked up the copy of the new will that had been provided for the defense. My eyes scanned past the ridiculous forged signatures of my parents and went straight to the bottom of the final page. Every legal document required a certified notary to witness the signatures. I stared at the blue ink stamp and the messy scrawled signature of the notary public. The name was Travis Miller. I felt a sharp edge of amusement cut through my anger. I knew exactly who Travis Miller was. He was Lauren's older brother and the black sheep of her already questionable family. He was not a respected legal professional operating out of a downtown firm. He was a struggling gambling addict who owed tens of thousands of dollars to loan sharks across the city. I had run a full comprehensive background check on Lauren's entire family tree the very day she married my brother. I knew all of their dirty secrets. I knew Travis had lost his notary license 3 years ago after being caught forging vehicle titles to cover his massive gambling debts. The state had stripped him of his credentials and threatened him with jail time. Andre and Lauren were so arrogant and so blindingly desperate for the $24 million that they had used a disgraced, desperate addict to forge the most important legal document of their lives. They assumed I was just a grieving sister who would burst into tears. They thought I would be too overwhelmed by the emotional shock of the new will to actually read the fine print and trace the origin of the notary stamp. I neatly folded the copy of the forged will and slipped it inside my designer clutch. I walked out of the courtroom without looking back, leaving Andre and Lauren whispering excitedly to their overpriced lawyer. They were probably planning their victory party, but their celebration was going to be incredibly short-lived. I stepped out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, the heavy glass doors closing behind me. I walked directly to my car, my mind already processing the next tactical move. I bypassed my usual route back to the federal office building and pulled onto the highway instead, heading toward the decaying industrial outskirts of the city. The scenery slowly shifted from towering glass skyscrapers to abandoned factories and crumbling warehouses. I knew exactly where to find Travis Miller without even needing to request a federal search warrant. His financial records, which I had memorized months ago, showed a consistent, pathetic pattern of daily credit card charges at a notorious rundown dive bar on the edge of the county line. It was a dark, forgotten place where desperate men went to hide from their violent debts and drink away their miserable failures in peace. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, feeling a cold, calculated focus settle over my entire body. Lauren and Andre had built their entire fragile house of cards on the shaky signature of a broken man, a man who would gladly sell out his own sister for a handful of cash and a ticket out of town. I pushed the gas pedal down, listening to the engine roar as I accelerated down the empty stretch of cracked asphalt road. I was going to walk straight into that smoky dive bar, drop the fake will on the sticky wooden counter, and give Travis Miller a very simple choice. He could either become a federal state witness and help me bury my brother, or he could spend the next 20 years of his life rotting in a maximum security prison for defrauding a federal investigator. The neon sign of the Rusty Anchor flickered weakly in the damp evening air, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravel parking lot. I parked my car in the darkest corner, stepping carefully over broken glass and discarded bottles. The heavy wooden door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The smell of stale beer and desperation hung thick in the air. The bar was nearly empty except for a few hunched figures hiding from their own miserable lives. I spotted him immediately. Travis Miller was sitting at the far end of the sticky mahogany bar clutching a cheap glass of whiskey. His suit jacket was deeply wrinkled and his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He looked exactly like the disgraced broken man my background checks had promised. I walked up quietly and slid onto the torn leather stool right next to him. He did not even bother to look up until I reached into my designer clutch and tossed the folded copy of the forged will directly onto his damp cocktail napkin. Travis stared down at the document, and all the color instantly drained from his face. He gasped, dropping his whiskey glass, and tried to slide off the stool to run, but I grabbed his arm with a grip that promised immediate violence. I calmly introduced myself as the sister of the man he was currently trying to defraud. I also introduced myself as a senior federal financial investigator. I watched the terror bloom in his bloodshot eyes as I told him I knew everything. I knew about his revoked notary license, his crippling gambling debts, and the violent loan sharks currently hunting him across the city limits. Travis started to hyperventilate, stammering that his sister Lauren had told him it was just a simple favor to speed up a legal technicality for her grieving husband. I laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made him flinch. I leaned in close and whispered the brutal truth into his ear. I explained that Lauren did not ask him for a sisterly favor. She had deliberately set him up as the sole fall guy in a $24 million federal extortion case. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at his messy signature on the bottom of the page. I told him that by stamping a fraudulent document to steal a massive estate, he had just committed multiple federal felonies. Lauren and Andre had carefully kept their own hands clean on the actual forging process, ensuring that when the Federal Bureau of Investigation inevitably audited the estate, Travis would be the only one holding the smoking gun. They were going to let him take the fall while they walked away with the fortune. The absolute terror in his eyes told me my words had shattered whatever illusions he had left. His chest heaved as the reality of his own sister's betrayal crashed over him. Travis broke down right there at the bar, weeping openly and running his trembling hands through his thinning hair. He started rambling, begging for mercy and offering to tell me everything if I just kept him out of a federal penitentiary. I pulled my encrypted federal recording device from my clutch and placed it on the sticky counter between our drinks. I told him to start talking and not to leave out a single detail. Travis spilled every toxic secret his sister had ever shared with him. He confessed that Lauren absolutely despised Andre and our entire family. He told me how she would mock Andre behind his back, calling him a pathetic, insecure weakling who was so desperate for white validation that he was incredibly easy to manipulate. The action-based backstory poured out of him in a desperate flood. Travis admitted that Lauren never had any intention of sharing the $24 million with my brother. Her grand master plan was to use the forged will to transfer all the liquid assets into the private family trust she now supposedly controlled. Once the money was secured, she was going to wire it to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, abandon Andre completely, and disappear to Europe under a new identity. She was going to leave her own brother and her husband to face the federal authorities alone, while she lived like a queen on my parents' stolen legacy. I sat there listening to the pathetic details of Lauren's greed. It was sickening, but it perfectly aligned with everything I knew about her. She was a parasite who fed on the insecurities of others. Travis swore he had no idea the estate was worth that much money. Lauren had paid him a miserable $5,000 to risk decades in prison. She had convinced him my parents were practically bankrupt and the paperwork was just to cover some outstanding debts. He gave me names, dates, and times detailing how Andre had provided an old signature from a birthday card for them to trace. He confessed that they had practiced tracing my parents' names for hours in Lauren's luxury kitchen while Andre stood watch at the window. I made sure the recording device captured every single syllable of his confession. I asked him if he would be willing to testify to all of this in a federal court under oath. He nodded frantically, promising to do whatever I wanted as long as I protected him from his sister and the authorities. I secured the recording device and slipped it back into my clutch. I had everything I needed to destroy them completely. I told Travis to stay seated and wait for my federal team to contact him for his official protective custody transfer. I turned to walk away, feeling the sweet rush of impending justice. But just as I reached the heavy wooden door of the dive bar, Travis called out my name. His voice was shaking even worse than before. He told me there was something else, something Lauren had bragged about just this morning when she handed him the cash. My blood ran cold as I turned back to face him. Travis swallowed hard and told me that Andre was not waiting for the probate judge to unfreeze the accounts. Andre had taken the fraudulent trust documents they forged and used them to bypass the standard banking holds. He told me that Andre was currently executing an illegal off-market cash sale of my parents' historic mansion. The property was worth millions, and Andre had found a corrupt private buyer willing to pay cold, hard cash with no questions asked. Travis looked at the clock on the wall and told me the private closing was happening right now at the mansion. They were literally selling my childhood home out from under me before the sun even went down. I threw my car into gear and sped away from the dive bar, leaving Travis sweating over his empty glass. The drive to my parents' historic mansion took less than 20 minutes, but my blood was boiling the entire way. Andre was not just trying to steal liquid cash, he was trying to liquidate our family history in a shady underground auction. When I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, I saw half a dozen sleek black luxury cars parked along the circular driveway. This was not a standard real estate closing. This was a private invite-only open house designed to pit corrupt cash investors against each other to drive up the price. I stepped out of my car, smoothing down my designer suit jacket and walking past the hired security guards at the front door. I confidently told them I was the proxy representative for an anonymous overseas billionaire who was highly interested in the property. They did not even blink and ushered me right inside. The grand foyer of the mansion was filled with the echoing sounds of classical music and clinking champagne glasses. I walked through the marble hallway and saw Andre holding court in the center of the massive living room. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and gesturing expansively toward the vaulted ceilings, playing the part of the wealthy grieving son, selling off a pristine family heirloom. There were about 10 wealthy investors gathered around him, nodding greedily as he spun his web of lies. Lauren was standing near the fireplace, smiling brightly, and pouring expensive champagne. I slipped into the back of the group, keeping my face shadowed. Andre was loudly boasting about the extensive structural renovations my parents had supposedly completed just last year. He told the buyers that the house had a brand new reinforced foundation, flawless plumbing, and top-of-the-line electrical wiring, making it a perfect turnkey investment. He promised them that the property was completely unencumbered and ready for an immediate discreet cash transfer. I could not hold back a sharp bark of laughter. The sound cut through the elegant music like a siren. The investors turned to look at me, and Andre's smug smile instantly collapsed into an expression of sheer panic. He stammered, asking what I was doing there. I slowly walked to the front of the group, making sure every single investor was hanging on my every word. I introduced myself not as a proxy, but as his sister and the actual legal executor of the estate. I turned to the group of wealthy buyers and told them they were being scammed by a desperate man. I explained that my parents had indeed set aside $3 million for structural renovations exactly 3 years ago. They had foolishly trusted Andre to manage the contractors and oversee the massive project because he claimed he had the best corporate connections. But Andre never hired a single legitimate contractor. Instead, he embezzled the entire renovation fund to cover his catastrophic stock market losses and feed his wife's shopping addiction. Andre started shouting that I was crazy and told the investors to ignore me. Lauren actually dropped a champagne glass, and it shattered loudly on the hardwood floor. I ignored their panic and walked straight over to the ornate wood-paneled wall near the grand staircase. I told the buyers that Andre had simply hired cheap, unlicensed labor to slap fresh paint and drywall over decades of dangerous rot to make the house look flawless for a quick sale. I grabbed the edge of a loose wooden panel that I knew had been poorly installed and ripped it away from the wall with a loud, cracking sound. A thick cloud of dust and the unmistakable foul stench of toxic black mold spilled into the pristine living room. The exposed beams behind the drywall were completely hollowed out by termites and damp rot. The wood crumbled like dry sand under my fingers. The entire structural support of that wing was practically turning to dust, and the foundation below us was slowly sinking into the earth. The investors gasped, covering their noses and stepping away from the wall in absolute disgust. The smell of decay was overwhelming. I calmly explained that the house was not a turnkey masterpiece, but a condemned hazard that required millions of dollars in immediate emergency repairs just to be legally habitable. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. The wealthy buyers looked at Andre with pure contempt. They realized he had tried to sell them a rotting hazard for millions in untraceable cash, leaving them to hold the bag when the walls literally caved in. One by one, the investors threw their champagne glasses down on the tables and stormed out of the front door, cursing under their breath about the colossal waste of time. Andre chased after them, begging them to reconsider and promising to lower the asking price, but they ignored him completely. Within 2 minutes, the grand house was completely empty, except for me, Andre, and Lauren. Andre slowly turned back to face me, his face purple with absolute fury. His chest heaved and he looked like a feral animal ready to snap. He screamed that I had just ruined his only chance to save himself, and that I had destroyed the family legacy just to prove a point. I stood my ground, telling him that he destroyed himself the moment he decided to forge our parents' will and steal from his own blood. Lauren was weeping on the sofa, rocking back and forth as her dreams of a European escape evaporated into the moldy air. She wailed that they were ruined and had no money left to run. Just as Andre took a threatening step toward me, his hands balled into tight fists. The heavy front door swung open again. A tall, imposing man in a sharp gray suit walked into the foyer, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Andre stopped in his tracks and demanded to know who he was. The man did not look like another investor or a lost buyer. He pulled a stack of official documents from his briefcase and introduced himself as a senior collections representative from the National Banking Consortium. He looked right past me, and locked eyes with my brother. The man announced in a cold professional voice that Andre's personal luxury penthouse downtown was officially in default. He stated that due to massive unpaid loans and clear evidence of financial fraud, the bank had initiated an emergency seizure of assets. He handed a stunned Andre the heavy stack of paperwork and informed him that local law enforcement was currently at the penthouse, sealing the doors and changing the locks. The man stated without any trace of sympathy that Andre and Lauren were no longer allowed on the premises and all of their personal belongings were currently being confiscated to pay down their massive debts. The bank representative turned on his heel and walked out the grand front doors, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt suffocating. Andre stood frozen in the center of the rotting living room, the thick stack of foreclosure papers trembling uncontrollably in his hands. The reality of his complete financial annihilation was finally crashing down on his shoulders. His luxury penthouse was officially gone. His bank accounts were entirely frozen. The wealthy investors who were supposed to be his desperate salvation had fled into the night in absolute disgust. He was a man who had spent his entire life standing on a golden pedestal built by my parents' stolen money, and now that pedestal had crumbled to toxic dust beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. The debris from the rotten wall I had just torn open still drifted heavily through the air, coating his designer suit in a fine gray powder that looked like cemetery ash. Lauren stared at the empty doorway, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. She looked frantically at Andre, waiting for him to fix it, waiting for him to use his arrogant charm to make the bad man go away. But Andre had absolutely nothing left to offer. The golden child was completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. I watched them panic from the bottom of the grand staircase, feeling an incredible sense of cold, clinical calm wash over me. I told them that since the house was an active crime scene of embezzlement and was legally under my jurisdiction as the federal investigator and rightful executor, they had exactly 5 minutes to vacate the premises before I called the local authorities and had them violently arrested for trespassing on federal evidence. Andre snapped his head toward me, his eyes wide with a manic, frantic energy that bordered on madness. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me I could not kick him out of his own childhood home. He reminded me that his penthouse was currently surrounded by local law enforcement and that he and his wife literally had nowhere else to sleep tonight. Their credit cards were suspended and their cash was gone. He demanded that I let them stay in the East Guest Wing, claiming it was his absolute birthright as the eldest son to seek shelter in the family estate whenever he needed it. He told me he was the true heir to the legacy, and I was just a bitter, jealous sister trying to punish him for being loved more by our dead parents. He raised his voice, trying to summon the old authority he used to hold over me to make me feel small and insignificant, but it sounded hollow and pathetic, echoing off the moldy walls of his ruined empire. When Andre realized his loud demands were bouncing harmlessly off my completely impassive expression, Lauren decided to step in. She completely abandoned her arrogant, wealthy housewife persona and dropped heavily to her knees right there on the dusty hardwood floor. The same woman who had spent years mocking my government career, mocking my practical clothes, and mocking my quiet isolation was now weeping openly and clutching frantically at the hem of my cheap navy suit. She begged me for female solidarity in a world run by ruthless men. She begged me as a woman, as a sister, as someone who supposedly understood how hard it was to survive without a safety net. She repeated the same desperate phrases over and over again, trying to wear down my psychological defenses with her pathetic rhythm. Please, Carmen, we have nothing left. Please, Carmen, I have nowhere to go. Please, Carmen, they are taking everything from us. Please, Carmen, you know what it is like to be left out in the cold. Please, Carmen, do not do this to another woman. Her tears mixed with the toxic dust on the floor, smearing her expensive mascara into a miserable gray mess down her cheeks. She tried to actively manipulate my empathy, trying to twist our shared gender into a weapon to save herself from the humiliation of the freezing streets. She sobbed that Andre had forced her into the forgery, that she was just a helpless victim of his aggressive ambition, and that we needed to stick together against the toxic men who had ruined our lives. I looked down at her grasping hands and felt absolutely nothing but a deep, profound disgust. The repetition of her begging did not sound like genuine sorrow. It just sounded like the panicked squealing of a trapped rat, trying to chew off its own leg to escape a snare. I calmly stepped backward, pulling my fabric away from her desperate, dirty grip. I told Lauren that female solidarity was strictly reserved for women who did not actively participate in forging legal documents to steal inheritances. I told her that female solidarity was for women who did not hire their own drug-addicted brothers to commit federal felonies and then set them up to take the fall. I told her that she was not my sister and she never would be. I walked right past her weeping form and went straight to the heavy oak front door, pulling it wide open to let the freezing evening air sweep into the stifling, ruined house. I pointed to the dark gravel driveway and told them their 5 minutes were officially up. Andre grabbed Lauren's arm, yanking her roughly to her feet. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. All the polished corporate charm had melted away, leaving only the vicious, spoiled child beneath the expensive fabric. He dragged her toward the doorway, muttering vile curses under his breath, promising that I would pay for doing this to him. As they crossed the threshold into the dark parking lot, I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, ready to seal my victory and lock them out of my life forever. But Andre turned back to look at me, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a desperate, vicious malice. He wanted to hurt me one last time before the door closed. He needed to leave a psychological scar that I could never erase with a federal audit. I began to push the heavy wood shut, but Andre's voice suddenly cut through the cold night air like a jagged physical blade. He screamed at me to wait. He screamed that I was so obsessed with finding financial crimes and acting like the perfect, flawless federal investigator that I had completely missed the real tragedy staring me right in the face. His voice echoed off the crumbling brick walls of the estate, growing louder and more hysterical with every single word. He shouted that my parents did not just die in a random tragic car accident on a rainy highway like the police report said. I paused, the heavy door suspended just inches from the frame, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. Andre saw my hesitation and lunged forward, pressing his face near the closing gap. He roared that my parents were driving at 90 miles an hour in the dead of night because they were absolutely terrified. They were terrified of me. He screamed through the narrow opening that they had found out about my secret federal investigation into their offshore shell companies. They knew I was auditing the family business, and they were fleeing the state in a blind panic to avoid the federal indictments I was quietly preparing to serve them. The heavy door finally clicked shut as he kept yelling, but his final words penetrated the thick, solid wood, vibrating straight into my bones and settling in my stomach like lead. Andre screamed that I was the direct reason their car went off the cliff, and that their blood was entirely on my hands. The heavy wood of the front door clicked shut, but Andre's venomous words bled through the cracks and buried themselves deep in my chest. He screamed that their blood was entirely on my hands. I stood in the dark foyer listening to the crunch of gravel as he and Lauren finally drove away into the freezing night. For a fraction of a second, the sheer weight of his accusation paralyzed me. Had they really been fleeing from my audit? Had my pursuit of justice actually driven them off that treacherous mountain road? But the cold, analytical part of my brain, the part that made me a ruthless federal investigator, instantly rejected the lie. My parents were terrified of losing their money, not their lives. Andre was simply cornered, and he was lashing out with the only weapon he had left, which was public manipulation. By morning, the entire narrative had shifted. Andre did not just leave his accusation on my doorstep. He went straight to the local media with a carefully crafted narrative of victimization. My phone started vibrating relentlessly before the sun even came up, When I turned on the television, my own face was plastered across the morning news broadcast right next to a glaring red headline that branded me a cold-blooded daughter. Andre had released a selectively edited video clip to the press. It was dashcam footage recovered from my parents' destroyed luxury sedan. The shaky, grainy video showed the interior of their car on the night of the crash. The rain was lashing against the windshield, and my father was driving erratically, speeding down the slick mountain pass. A digital timestamp flashed in the corner, proving the frantic drive happened mere minutes after a recorded phone call between my father and me. The news anchors dissected the silent footage with grim fascination. They played an audio clip of Andre weeping during an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. He sobbed into the microphones, claiming that his sister was a ruthless government auditor who cared more about federal indictments than family loyalty. He told the reporters that I had threatened our parents with prison time over minor tax discrepancies, causing them to flee the state in absolute terror. The media swallowed the lie whole. Social media algorithms pushed the video to millions of viewers, turning my private family tragedy into a viral spectacle. Commentators and armchair detectives flooded the internet calling me a monster, an ungrateful child who abused her federal power to hunt her own parents to their deaths. When I walked into the federal building that morning, the atmosphere was suffocating. Colleagues who usually greeted me with warm smiles now averted their eyes and suddenly busied themselves with paperwork. The silence in the hallways was deafening. My supervisor called me into his glass-walled office and gently suggested that I take an extended administrative leave while the public relations department handled the optics of the viral video. He told me the department could not risk the negative exposure of having an alleged family killer spearheading high-profile financial investigations. My badge and credentials were temporarily suspended. Andre had successfully weaponized the court of public opinion to strip away my professional credibility and paint himself as the grieving victim of my supposedly tyrannical ambition. I returned to the empty mansion and sat at the massive mahogany dining table, staring at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence of the house pressed in on me, but I refused to let Andre's fabricated narrative become the official truth. I opened my encrypted federal laptop and stared at the glowing screen. The police report from the night of the crash was a matter of public record. My parents' sedan had crossed the center line on a blind curve and collided head-on with a commercial freight truck. The truck driver had survived with minor injuries, but the collision had sent my parents' car careening off the cliff face. The local police had closed the case as a tragic weather-related accident, and the dashcam footage Andre leaked conveniently cut off 10 seconds before the actual impact. I knew there was more to the story. If my parents were truly fleeing in a blind panic, I needed to know exactly what was said in that car before the crash. I bypassed the standard judicial request forms, knowing the bureaucratic red tape would take weeks to clear. Instead, I used my advanced clearance and specialized tracking software to penetrate the commercial trucking company's highly secure cloud database. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the specific vehicle identification number of the freight truck involved in the accident. Commercial trucks were equipped with heavy-duty black box recorders that captured not just telemetry data, but continuous interior and exterior audio feeds. The trucking company had quietly uploaded the crash data to their legal servers months ago for insurance purposes. It took me exactly 45 minutes to break through their firewall and locate the specific encrypted audio files from that rainy night on the mountain pass. The security protocols were intense, but my anger fueled my focus. I downloaded the raw, unedited black box data directly onto my secure hard drive. The file contained the isolated audio from the exact moment of the collision, including the ambient frequencies picked up from my parents' vehicle right before the impact. I connected my high-definition noise-canceling headphones and pressed play. The sound of heavy rain and the rhythmic thumping of the truck's windshield wipers filled my ears. Then I applied an advanced audio filter to extract and isolate the voices coming from my parents' approaching sedan. What I heard in those final moments was not the sound of parents terrified of a federal audit. It was the sound of my father screaming at someone on the car's Bluetooth speakerphone. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic and demanding, and it did not belong to me. It belonged to Andre. He was yelling at my father, demanding that he transfer the offshore funds immediately before the federal freeze took effect. My mother was sobbing in the background, begging my father to slow down while he frantically tried to navigate the treacherous mountain curves and execute a complex digital wire transfer on his phone at the exact same time. Andre was not the grieving son mourning his parents' tragic accident. He was the desperate, greedy catalyst who was screaming at them for money, right up until the exact second the blinding truck headlights appeared and the audio cut out into terrifying static. The static hissed through my headphones, echoing in the silent mansion, as the horrifying reality of my parents' final moments settled over me like a suffocating shroud. They were not fleeing from my federal audit. They were fleeing from him. The annual memorial gala at the historic downtown cathedral was scheduled for the very next evening. It was supposed to be a high-profile charity event dedicated to my parents' philanthropic legacy. The sanctuary was packed with city elites, local politicians, and wealthy donors who had all bought into Andre's fabricated tragedy. I stood in the shadows near the heavy wooden doors of the cathedral, watching my brother play the ultimate grieving son. He wore a crisp black suit and stood near the altar, dabbing his eyes with a folded linen handkerchief as the bishop spoke about my parents' untimely passing. Lauren was right beside him, gripping his arm and looking mournfully at the stained glass windows. The local news cameras were positioned in the aisles, capturing every single tear for the evening broadcast. Andre stepped up to the marble pulpit, adjusting the microphone with trembling hands. He began to weave a masterful web of lies, painting a picture of our parents as terrified victims of an overzealous federal government. He actually choked back a sob as he talked about how families should always protect each other, and how my cruel investigation had driven our parents to their watery graves. The congregation murmured in collective sympathy. Some people were actually crying. It was the perfect performance. It was the exact moment I needed to destroy him completely. I walked out of the shadows and straight down the center aisle. My footsteps rang out sharply against the stone floor, cutting through the soft, sympathetic murmurs of the crowd. The news cameras instantly pivoted toward me, tracking my every move. Andre stopped speaking, his mouth hanging open in mid-sentence as he saw me approaching the altar. He frantically waved at the security guards to stop me, but I simply held up my federal badge and kept walking. I bypassed the security detail completely and marched up the marble steps. I did not look at Andre. I pulled my encrypted audio device from my pocket and plugged the auxiliary cable directly into the cathedral's main sound system. Andre lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone, but I shoved him backward with a firm, heavy push. I turned to the packed cathedral and told them they were about to hear the real reason my parents died on that mountain road. I hit play. The raw, unedited black box audio blasted through the massive acoustic speakers of the church. The sound of the pouring rain and the squeaking windshield wipers filled the cavernous room, followed immediately by my father's panicked voice. The congregation gasped as they heard my father screaming into his car's Bluetooth system. He was not talking to me. He was talking to his private defense attorney on a three-way conference call with Andre. The audio was crystal clear and absolutely damning. My father was shouting that he had just uncovered the hidden financial ledgers deep within the company network. He was screaming at Andre, demanding to know why the family manufacturing empire was suddenly leveraged to the breaking point. Andre's voice crackled through the speakers, sounding frantic and vicious. Andre was yelling that he had no choice and that he owed $20 million to a violent underground syndicate. He confessed right there on the tape that he had secretly forged our parents' signatures and mortgaged the entire family business to the mob to cover his massive illegal gambling debts. My mother was sobbing in the background, begging my father to keep his eyes on the treacherous road as the storm raged outside. The brutal truth poured out of the church speakers in a horrifying flood. My father yelled that the loan sharks had already visited the estate that evening, threatening my mother's life if the massive debt was not paid by midnight. He screamed at Andre that they were currently driving straight to the federal police headquarters to turn him in. My father told Andre that he would rather see his own son rot in a federal penitentiary than let the mob take everything they had built and destroy the rest of our lives. Andre was screaming back, begging them to turn the car around, threatening that the syndicate would kill all of them if they went to the police. My parents were not running from my audit. They were racing through a deadly storm to save our family from the violent criminals Andre had brought to our doorstep. And then the sickening sound of the commercial truck horn blasted through the speakers, followed by the deafening crunch of tearing metal before the tape cut to dead silent static. The silence in the cathedral was absolute and heavy. The horrific reality of the recording hung over the congregation like a dark cloud. The news cameras were still rolling, broadcasting Andre's confession and his mob ties to the entire city. The wealthy donors and local politicians stared at my brother in pure, unadulterated horror. He was not a grieving victim. He was the reason the mob had targeted our parents, causing the panicked flight that led directly to their brutal deaths. Andre stood frozen at the altar, his face completely drained of color. His perfectly crafted illusion was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked at the crowd and then looked at me, his lips trembling as he tried to formulate a lie, but there was nowhere left to hide. The evidence was indisputable. I turned to look at Lauren, expecting her to defend him or try to spin the narrative like she always did. Instead, I watched pure survival instinct completely take over her features. She looked at the glowing red lights of the news cameras, then looked at the furious crowd, and finally looked at the man she had conspired with for years. Lauren physically shoved Andre away from her so hard he stumbled backward and crashed into the marble pulpit. She threw her hands up in the air and screamed at the top of her lungs that she had absolutely no idea about any of this. She shrieked that Andre had lied to her about the money and the mob, and that she would never knowingly associate with a violent syndicate or be an accessory to felony murder. She backed down the altar steps, pointing a manicured finger at his chest, and screamed that she was filing for an immediate emergency divorce, right this second, to save her own life. She turned and ran down the center aisle, fleeing the church and leaving Andre completely alone to face the devastating consequences of his own toxic greed. The sound of Lauren's frantic footsteps echoed through the cavernous cathedral, before fading completely into the rainy night, leaving Andre entirely alone to face the horrifying consequences of his own toxic greed. The wealthy donors and local politicians began murmuring loudly, pulling out their phones to call their lawyers and distance themselves from my brother's newly confessed mob connections. Andre stood frozen under the glowing stained glass windows, staring at the empty center aisle where his wife had just abandoned him. The reality of his complete destruction finally shattered the arrogant facade he had worn his entire life. His shoulders slumped and his legs gave out beneath him. Instead of trying to run from the furious crowd, the golden child collapsed onto the cold marble steps right at my feet. The man who had spent 3 decades looking down on me, treating me like an invisible disappointment, was now weeping openly and clutching desperately at my ankles. Andre buried his face against my shoes, sobbing uncontrollably and begging for my protection. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and tried to weaponize the very family bonds he had just destroyed. He cried out that blood was thicker than water, and that we were the only true family we had left in this world. His voice cracked as he begged me to drop to my knees and help him. He pleaded with me to use my federal authority to hunt Lauren down and ruin her before she ruined him. He pointed a trembling finger at the door, claiming that Lauren was the true mastermind behind everything. He spun a pathetic tale, insisting that she had manipulated his deep grief over our parents and forced him into making desperate deals with the violent underground syndicate. He swore that if I just helped him destroy her, he would make everything right, and we could go back to being a perfect, happy family. I looked down at the pathetic broken man groveling on the floor and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. I slowly pulled my foot free from his desperate, grasping hands, stepping back to create a physical barrier between us. I looked him dead in the eyes and flatly refused his manipulative pleas. I told him that blood meant absolutely nothing to a son who would gladly mortgage his own parents' legacy to ruthless criminals, just to cover his pathetic gambling debts. The truth of our entire relationship poured out of me in a calm, steady voice. I reminded him of how he used to openly mock my quiet dedication to my government career, laughing at my modest apartment while he paraded around the city in expensive sports cars, bought with our parents' stolen money. He had always been a parasite feeding off the family wealth while I built my own strength and independence in the shadows. I told him I would not lift a single finger to save him from Lauren because they were both toxic predators who completely deserved each other. I turned my back on his pathetic sobbing and pulled my encrypted federal tablet from my jacket pocket. I told Andre that local law enforcement was already pulling up to the front doors of the cathedral to arrest him for financial fraud and criminal conspiracy. I told him he was no longer my concern because my real focus was already miles away. While Andre was wasting his breath begging for mercy on a church floor, I was already actively hunting his runaway wife. My federal monitoring software was pinging rapidly as Lauren frantically attempted to drain the offshore trust fund. She was sitting in the back of a speeding taxi using her phone to initiate massive international wire transfers. She was desperately trying to funnel the remaining liquid assets into untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands before the National Banking Consortium completely froze her out. What Lauren did not know was that I had already flagged those specific routing numbers the exact moment I took over as the legal executor of the estate. Every single desperate transfer she attempted triggered a silent alarm feeding her exact geographic location directly into my tracking system. I watched the blinking red dot on my screen move rapidly down the interstate heading straight for the international airport. Lauren was a cornered animal running on pure adrenaline and greed. My network alerts showed that before she fled the city, she had bypassed the bank seizure by looting their hidden wall safe. She had stuffed heavy canvas duffel bags with raw, bundled cash diamond necklaces and antique family jewelry that belonged to our grandmother. She was trying to escape the country with millions of dollars in stolen, untraceable physical assets. I tapped the screen locking onto her digital signature as her taxi pulled into the departure lane of Terminal 4. The tracking dot stopped moving, pinpointing her exact location just past the international security checkpoint. Lauren arrived at the departure gate, her usually flawless designer clothes wrinkled and soaked with rain. Her arms were shaking and straining under the immense weight of the stuffed duffel bags pulling her shoulders down and leaving deep red welts on her skin. She was sweating heavily, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds in pure paranoia as she clutched a first-class ticket to a country with no extradition treaty. The terminal was nearly empty, and she watched with wide, desperate eyes as the airline staff announced the final boarding call over the loudspeaker. The heavy glass doors of the jetway slid open, and Lauren took a deep, breathless step forward, clutching her stolen fortune tightly against her chest, firmly believing she had finally beaten the system and secured her golden escape. Lauren took a breathless step toward the jetway, her knuckles white as she gripped the heavy canvas bag stuffed with my family's stolen wealth. The gate attendant smiled and reached out to scan her first-class boarding pass. That was the exact moment I stepped out from behind the frosted glass partition of the VIP lounge, placing myself directly between Lauren and her golden escape route. The smile melted off her face so fast, it was almost comical, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer terror. She stumbled backward, clutching the duffel bags to her chest as if they could somehow protect her from federal jurisdiction. I calmly flashed my gold badge at the gate attendant, instructing them to halt the boarding process for this passenger. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute icy authority in my tone made the surrounding passengers freeze in their tracks. I told her that the business she was conducting involved embezzling millions of dollars from an estate under active federal audit. Lauren began to hyperventilate, stammering that I had no right to stop her and that she was a private citizen traveling on legitimate business. She desperately shoved her boarding pass and her sleek dark blue passport at the confused attendant, screaming at him to scan it immediately so she could get on the plane. She yelled that I was just a jealous sister-in-law making up wild accusations. I pulled my encrypted agency tablet from my blazer pocket and tapped the final confirmation sequence I had been holding on the screen. I looked up and told Lauren to go ahead and let him scan it. The attendant swiped the passport over the optical reader and a loud, harsh buzz echoed through the terminal. The screen flashed bright red with an international travel block. Lauren's eyes widened in disbelief as she watched the attendant try it again, with the same jarring result. I calmly explained that as of 30 seconds ago, I had initiated a Level 4 federal asset freeze on every single account routing number and travel document associated with her name. Her credit cards were now useless plastic. Her offshore wire transfers were frozen in transit by international banking authorities. Her passport was officially flagged by Homeland Security, preventing her from crossing any borders. The heavy canvas bag slipped from her hands, hitting the airport carpet with a heavy metallic thud that sounded suspiciously like our grandmother's antique silver. Lauren looked down at the bags and then back up at me, her face contorting from panic into something incredibly ugly and vicious. The terrified victim routine vanished completely. The polished high society housewife facade cracked wide open, revealing the deep-seated rot underneath. Lauren lunged forward, her voice echoing through the terminal as she unleashed a torrent of vile, racist insults that she had clearly been harboring for years. She screamed that she never wanted to be part of our pathetic family anyway. The action-based backstory poured out of her in a hateful flood as she shrieked about how humiliating it was to marry into a family she considered beneath her just because we had money. She yelled that Andre was a weak, pathetic man who was so desperate for her white validation that he happily let her manipulate him into stealing his own parents' fortune. She called my parents disgusting names, mocking their traditional accents and the humble immigrant roots they came from before they built their empire. She screamed that our family was nothing but filthy new money and that she deserved every single diamond in those bags as compensation for having to endure our cultural traditions at holiday dinners. She yelled that we were animals who did not know how to handle real wealth, and that she was simply taking back what rightfully belonged in the hands of a superior class. The surrounding passengers gasped in shock at the vitriol pouring from her mouth. Two armed airport security officers who had been alerted by my federal flag quickly approached the gate. Lauren was so blinded by her hateful rant that she did not even see them until they grabbed her arms. She thrashed wildly, kicking and spitting as they forced her wrists behind her back. She demanded that they release her, screaming that she was a wealthy VIP and they were making a mistake. The officers ignored her racist tirade, completely clicking heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists and informing her that she was being detained under federal warrants for grand larceny and flight to avoid prosecution. I stood perfectly still watching as they dragged her away through the terminal. Her designer heels scraped against the polished floor, her expensive coat tearing at the seams as she fought the officers. She kept screaming my name, cursing my existence and promising to destroy me in court, but her voice grew fainter and fainter until she was thrown into the back of a security transport vehicle. I bent down and picked up the heavy canvas duffel bags, securing my grandmother's stolen jewelry and the millions in raw cash. The threat Lauren posed was officially neutralized, and she would be spending the rest of her life in a federal penitentiary where her racist entitlement would not buy her a single ounce of comfort. I walked out of the terminal, breathing in the cool night air, feeling a profound sense of closure regarding Lauren. But the war was not over. My phone vibrated in my pocket with a high-priority alert from the Corporate Intelligence Division. It was an emergency notification regarding the family manufacturing empire. Back at the estate, Andre had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. Assuming that Lauren had successfully fled the country, and that my attention was entirely consumed with chasing her down, he had quietly retreated to the company headquarters. The notification on my screen indicated that Andre had just bypassed the standard corporate bylaws and initiated an emergency late-night hostile takeover of the entire executive board to seize absolute control of the remaining assets before sunrise. The rain was still pouring in heavy sheets as I stood outside Terminal 4 staring at the blinking alert on my encrypted tablet. Andre was not just trying to steal the company, he was trying to erase me from it completely before the sun even came up. I slid into the back of my waiting federal vehicle and immediately dialed Director Vance. He was the head of the regional FBI field office, and he had been monitoring my quiet investigation into the syndicate for months. I told him Andre was making his final desperate move at the corporate headquarters, and that I needed him to meet me there with a tactical team. The drive across the dark city felt like a blur of neon lights and wet asphalt, but my mind was completely sharp. Andre was so painfully predictable in his arrogance. He genuinely believed that simply because he wore our father's name and paraded around in custom-tailored suits, he was inherently entitled to everything our parents had built from the ground up. By the time I arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that housed our family manufacturing empire, the emergency board meeting was already well underway. I bypassed the lobby security desk using my overriding executive credentials and rode the private glass elevator up to the top floor, with Director Vance standing silently right beside me. The heavy mahogany doors to the executive boardroom were cracked open just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough for me to hear Andre's voice echoing loudly down the quiet marble corridor. I held up a hand to stop the director and the two armed federal agents flanking us. I did not want to interrupt him just yet. I wanted to hear exactly how my brother was digging his own grave. We stepped quietly into the dark antechamber just outside the boardroom and peered through the narrow opening. Andre was pacing relentlessly at the head of the massive obsidian conference table, looking like a grotesque caricature of unearned corporate power. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's annual salary, and he was pouring generous glasses of 20-year-old scotch for the corrupt board members he had managed to drag out of bed at 2 in the morning. He was gloating with a sickening level of toxic confidence. He slammed his crystal glass down on the table and declared that our parents were soft and that their outdated compassionate business model was holding the company back from its true potential. He completely dismissed my entire existence, telling the board that I was nothing but a hysterical, emotional woman who cared more about federal red tape and bureaucratic rules than building a true family dynasty. I watched as he leaned across the polished table, his face flushed with greed and artificial authority. He told the sycophantic executives that he was the only man capable of carrying the family legacy forward into the modern era. He arrogantly claimed that my federal career was an embarrassment to the family name, and that I lacked the ruthless killer instinct required to run a global manufacturing empire. He promised them that under his sole masculine leadership, the company would see explosive profits they had never even dreamed of. Then he pulled out a thick stack of manila envelopes and began sliding them across the dark table to the remaining board members. They were massive off-the-books bonuses, pure bribes disguised as emergency executive compensation, designed to buy their total loyalty and secure their votes for the hostile takeover. He was literally paying them off with the very funds he had illegally leveraged from the violent underground syndicate. Andre walked back to the head of the table and dramatically unrolled a thick stack of legal documents. He announced that the motion on the floor was to officially oust me from my position as legal co-executor of the estate, citing my ongoing federal investigation as a severe conflict of interest that threatened the financial stability of the entire company. He told them that for the business to survive the current public relations nightmare caused by our parents' tragic accident, they desperately needed a single unified voice of leadership. He demanded that the board vote to immediately transfer absolute sole ownership of the entire $24 million estate directly into his name. The greedy board members did not even hesitate for a single second. They eagerly clutched their bribe envelopes and raised their hands in unanimous agreement, legally voting to strip me of my inheritance and hand the keys to the kingdom over to a man who had already mortgaged the castle to ruthless loan sharks. Andre beamed with pure arrogant triumph. He laughed loudly, calling them all brilliant visionaries and thanking them for their unwavering loyalty to the true heir of the family business. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open and stepped into the brightly lit boardroom. The loud, heavy thud of the doors hitting the wall echoed like a gunshot, causing every single head at the table to snap violently in my direction. The self-satisfied smirks completely vanished from the faces of the corrupt executives as they saw me standing there. But I was not alone. Director Vance stepped into the room right beside me, his golden FBI badge gleaming brightly against his dark suit, followed closely by his armed tactical agents, who immediately moved to secure all the exits. Andre froze completely solid with a gold-plated fountain pen hovering just an inch above the final signature line of the takeover document. His eyes darted frantically from me to the federal agents and back again, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. The bloated arrogance that had fueled his entire speech just moments ago evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but the terrified little boy he had always truly been. I did not yell. I did not scream or demand an explanation. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and stared at him with cold, absolute detachment. I told him not to stop his big moment on my account. I told him that I wanted to watch him finish exactly what he started. I stood at the back of the silent room and watched as Andre stared down at the binding legal document that would grant him absolute sole ownership of the $24 million estate. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely hold the heavy gold pen. He looked at the board members, who were now shrinking back into their expensive leather chairs, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from him. Andre thought he was stealing my birthright and finally claiming his rightful throne. He thought he was outsmarting me and securing his future. But the beautiful irony was that by claiming sole legal ownership of the entire company, he was simultaneously claiming absolute sole legal responsibility for every single fraudulent loan, every forged signature, and every toxic crushing debt tied to the violent syndicate. He was actively taking the entire massive criminal liability squarely onto his own shoulders, effectively absolving me of any legal connection to his deadly mess. I nodded toward the paper and calmly told him to sign it. I stood back and watched as Andre, realizing he was completely trapped and totally out of options, slowly lowered the pen to the paper and proudly signed his own name to his absolute destruction. Andre lifted the heavy gold pen from the thick parchment, and a sickeningly triumphant smile spread across his pale face. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed off the dark mahogany walls of the boardroom and bounced off the floor to ceiling glass windows overlooking the sleeping city. He looked directly at me and sneered, telling me that I was a complete fool for just standing in the back of the room and letting him sign away my entire future. He bragged that he had finally won the long war between us and that I was now officially locked out of the family empire forever. He slammed his open hands down on the polished stone table and declared that I had absolutely nothing left to my name, while he was now the undisputed sole owner of a $24 million legacy. He told the silent federal agents standing by the heavy wooden doors that they could leave the building now because this was a private corporate matter and the reigning chief executive officer was officially ordering them off the premises. I did not blink, and I certainly did not panic. I simply walked over to the antique wooden credenza at the side of the room and slowly poured myself a glass of iced water from the heavy crystal pitcher. The ice clinked softly against the glass, breaking the thick, suffocating silence that had suddenly descended upon the room. My absolute chilling confidence instantly caused the triumphant and arrogant energy in the boardroom to completely evaporate into thin air. The corrupt executives who were excitedly clutching their fat cash bribe envelopes just moments ago began to shift uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. Large drops of nervous cold sweat started forming on their foreheads as they watched me take a slow, deliberate sip of my water. They were seasoned corporate sharks, and they knew exactly what a cornered animal looked like. But they also knew that I was standing there acting like the apex predator who had just locked the cage doors from the outside. I set the crystal glass down on the wooden surface and reached into my dark leather briefcase, pulling out a massive, thick file folder that I had been carrying with me all night. The bright red seal of the United States Department of the Treasury was stamped aggressively across the front cover, standing out like a glowing beacon in the dim, moody lighting of the executive boardroom. I tossed the heavy federal file onto the center of the obsidian conference table, right on top of Andre's freshly signed binding takeover document. The heavy thud made Andre flinch backward, his arrogant smile finally faltering as his panicked eyes locked onto the official government seal. I looked around the long table at the terrified executives and told them that they had all been so completely blinded by Andre's empty promises of unlimited wealth that they failed to do even a basic baseline audit of the estate they had just gladly handed over to him. I turned my attention back to my brother and watched the color rapidly drain from his cheeks until he looked entirely, completely hollow. I told Andre that he was absolutely right about one specific thing, which was that I had just willingly let him take total legal ownership of the entire $24 million estate without putting up a single ounce of a fight. But then I asked him if he actually possessed the mental capacity to understand what that $24 million consisted of today. His face went completely blank as I began to open the heavy treasury file and read the meticulously itemized list of his newly acquired assets out loud for the entire room to hear. I explained that our parents' liquid cash accounts had already been entirely drained by the offshore wire transfers Lauren was currently trying to steal at the international airport terminal. I told him the family mansions, the sprawling vacation properties, and the luxury vehicles had all been quietly leveraged to the absolute maximum limit, using the forged legal signatures he had provided to his criminal friends. The boardroom was dead silent as I flipped to the next page, revealing the horrific reality of his new glorious empire. I told him that the $24 million valuation he kept throwing in my face was not a list of profitable assets or company capital. It was a meticulously calculated list of outstanding criminal liabilities and massive sinking debt structures. I explained in a slow, agonizingly clear voice that by signing that binding document, Andre had just legally claimed personal financial responsibility for $8 million in outstanding federal tax evasion penalties. He had just legally claimed sole ownership of $12 million in fraudulent corporate loans taken out under false pretenses across 3 different untraceable shell companies. And most importantly, he had just legally bound his own name to the remaining $4 million in toxic underground gambling debts owed directly to the very violent syndicate that had chased our parents to their gruesome deaths on the mountain road. I looked down at my brother, who was now violently hyperventilating and clutching his chest as the invisible walls of his own trap closed in around him. The corrupt board members were frantically scrambling out of their chairs, desperately trying to leave their thick bribe envelopes on the table and sneak out the back doors. But Director Vance and his tactical agents firmly blocked every single exit, preventing anyone from leaving the active crime scene. I leaned over the polished table, placing my hands flat against the cool black stone, and stared directly into Andre's terrified, weeping eyes. I told him that he did not just steal my inheritance, he just foolishly volunteered to take the absolute fall for a massive international racketeering conspiracy, and that this crushing mountain of debt was only the very tip of a much larger federal iceberg that was about to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. I watched the exact moment his brain finally processed the magnitude of his own stupidity. The $24 million estate he had been salivating over for months was nothing but a beautiful hollow shell. I walked slowly around the dark conference table, letting the silence amplify his rising panic as he stared at the treasury documents spread out before him. I told him the ugly truth about our parents' final days and the empire they left behind. They did not build this company to pass it down to a brilliant successor. They spent their last few years desperately trying to cover up a massive $30 million deficit that was caused entirely by Andre's relentless, reckless embezzlement. He had always believed he was simply siphoning money from a bottomless well to fund his luxury sports cars, his lavish vacations, and his private jets. But he had actually hollowed out the core of the family business until it was nothing but toxic, rotting debt. I leaned in close to him so the terrified board members could not miss a single word of his humiliation. I explained that our parents knew the company was going under, and their original will explicitly stated that whoever claimed the estate would legally inherit every single associated financial liability. That was the crucial detail, the action-based backstory that none of them had bothered to understand. I reminded Andre about the day the original will was read. The day he and Lauren sat in the plush leather chairs of the lawyer's office smirking at me while I flatly refused to sign the estate documents. The whole family whispered that I was just a jealous, bitter daughter throwing a tantrum because I felt slighted by my parents' legacy. My aunts and uncles gossiped that I was too weak to handle the pressure of running a global business. But my refusal was never born out of jealousy or weakness. I had read the fine print long before that family meeting ever took place. My corporate intelligence division had already secretly audited the family accounts, and I knew from day one that signing that piece of paper was absolute financial suicide. I had literally handed him the rope, and he had eagerly tied the noose himself. I told him that if he had just left things alone and accepted my guidance, the federal government would have simply seized the remaining assets to quietly pay off the debt, and we both could have walked away clean with our lives intact. But his suffocating masculine pride and his insatiable toxic greed would not let him do that. He could not stand the thought of me having any connection to the family wealth or any authority over his decisions. So by forcing this illegal midnight board meeting, bribing corrupt executives, and aggressively claiming absolute sole ownership of the estate right in front of the director of the FBI, he had just legally bound his own name to a $30 million federal debt and multiple counts of severe corporate fraud. There was no legal loophole, and there was no escape route left to take. He was the sole owner of a sinking ship, and the captain was going down with it. The horrific reality of his situation crashed into him like a physical blow. Andre collapsed heavily into his expensive leather chair and buried his face in his trembling hands. The arrogant golden boy facade shattered into a million jagged pieces as a pathetic, agonizing wail ripped from his throat. He started sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to fix it, pleading with me to use my federal connections and my agency influence to make the debt disappear. He promised to give me the company back, to publicly apologize to the entire industry, and to do whatever I wanted for the rest of his life. It was completely pathetic to watch a man who had acted like a god just moments ago now, crumbling into a weeping mess on the boardroom floor. Director Vance did not give him another moment to beg for mercy. He signaled the tactical agents and they moved in swiftly and without hesitation. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the quiet boardroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Andre thrashed and screamed as they hauled him out of his chair, his custom-tailored charcoal suit tearing at the shoulder seam as he fought fruitlessly against the armed agents. He shrieked my name, crying out that we were blood and that I could not do this to my own brother. I stood perfectly still with my hands folded in front of me and watched them drag him out of the room, kicking and crying like a spoiled child whose toys had finally been taken away. Between his federal tax evasion, the racketeering charges, and the hostile takeover fraud, he would be spending decades behind bars right alongside his beloved wife Lauren, who was currently sitting in a cold airport holding cell facing her own extensive prison sentence for grand larceny and international flight. As they hauled him down the marble corridor, the corrupt board members who had just voted to illegally oust me scrambled out of their seats in a sheer panic. They rushed toward me with their hands raised in surrender, stammering desperate apologies and begging for leniency. My toxic extended relatives, who had sneaked into the back of the room to gleefully witness my corporate downfall, suddenly changed their entire tune. My aunts and uncles, who had relentlessly mocked my federal career and praised Andre's brilliant business acumen, were now tripping over themselves to tell me they always knew I was the smart one. They cried and begged for my forgiveness, promising that they had been manipulated by Andre and that they had always loved me best. I did not say a single word to any of them. I simply picked up my encrypted agency tablet, adjusted the collar of my blazer, and walked right past their pleading faces. They did not exist to me anymore. The toxic rot of this family had finally been completely excised, and I was not going to spend another second breathing in the poisonous air of their desperate lies. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped into the cool, refreshing rain. The heavily armored federal vehicles were already pulling away from the curb, carrying my brother to his new concrete home. I took a deep, long breath, feeling a profound, incredible sense of peace wash over my entire body. A sleek black town car was waiting for me at the edge of the plaza. My private driver opened the door, and I slid into the quiet, luxurious interior. I told him to take me directly to the private airfield. There was absolutely nothing left for me in this broken city. The crumbling $24 million illusion was completely behind me, and I was finally heading back to my real life in New York. I pulled out my phone and checked the real-time market reports for the multi-hundred-million-dollar investment fund that I actually owned and managed. My independent wealth was staggering, completely clean, and entirely mine, built far away from their toxic influence. I leaned back against the soft leather seat and watched the city lights blur past the wet window, finally leaving the ghosts of my family behind as I drove off into the night, completely free and absolutely triumphant. The ultimate lesson learned from this ordeal is that blinding greed and toxic arrogance will always engineer their own destruction. Andre's desperate obsession with power and status made him the perfect architect of his own downfall. He was so eager to steal the crown that he never realized it was wired to a bomb. Meanwhile, Carmen proves that true strength requires no shouting. Quiet, meticulous preparation and unshakable self-worth are the ultimate weapons against narcissistic abusers. By detaching emotionally and building independent success, you allow their vicious entitlement to become the exact trap that permanently removes them from your life. Share your own stories of walking away from toxic family dynamics in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering content.